Hey y'all, Eli with Alchemy Custom Weaponry here. Welcome back to the channel. Been a couple of weeks, but we're back and we're going to be talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. We do have an exciting resto mod coming up at the end of the year. I don't want to give too much away, but it's going to be pretty freaking sick. And we're super stoked to be rounding out 2024 with something really unique and something we've never done and we've never really seen done before, so I'm excited for that. Next thing, you're going to probably notice that the lighting in here a little more dramatic. I'm just trying it out, seeing how it goes. Most of the time, you're not looking at what I'm showing right here anyways. I'm showing pictures or B-roll on the screen, so hopefully you like this. Maybe you don't, I don't know. So let's get into it, and let's talk about what I consider to be, okay, one of the coolest custom 1911 things someone could have. Okay, you know, it's the ring hammer. We all know how I feel about that. The ring hammer, it's one of those things that makes you feel a little tingle in the dingle, right? But there's something else that I think is equally as cool in the old custom 1911 world that Alchemy still offers that some of y'all ain't really taking advantage of. And I'm telling you right now, okay, we've had the square guard available since the conception of the company, and really not very many people have ordered a square guard gun, and I think part of that's because we've forgotten what's cool. So I'm here to remind you what's cool, and that sure as hell is going to be a square guard 1911, but we're going to talk about a little bit more than just the Alchemy square guard. We're going to go back in time. I'm going to take you back to the genesis of the square guard. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen, buckle up. I'm real excited about this one. So Square Guard 1911s, I think they are just one of the coolest looking guns. And in fact, if your goal is to have something that kind of gives off that vibe, if you will, of a kind of late 60s to late 80s, even some into the 90s, as we'll see, custom gun, the Square Guard's hard to beat. So the Square Guard, who started that? Well, I've actually got an example from the gentleman who did start this, and this is a Swenson Bobcat. So Armand Swenson is kind of known to be sort of the I don't want to call him the originator of the square guard because I don't know for certain, but he's kind of widely accepted as the first guy to put the square guard kind of on the map. Now, when we look at the history of where custom 1911s were, this is really the birth of what we call a fighting gun or a custom, we'll call it combat pistol, right? Armand Swenson got really involved early on with the Southwest Combat Pistol League, okay? That's what really spurred the kind of move from a bullseye, national match style of shooting competition to a faster pace, more, we'll call it realistic, but more kind of combat-focused competition shooting, okay? So this is in the late 60s. So Gene Shuey, one of the competitors there in the Southwest Pistol League, he kind of came to Armand and he said, listen, they were all, the modern kind of pistol technique was really in its infancy there with Jeff Cooper. And obviously Cooper was very involved in the Southwest Combat Pistol League as well. That was kind of his baby. And as they were shooting the guns faster and developing kind of that modern handgun grip, one of the things that people really seem to begin to like to do is to put their finger on the trigger guard there. Now, on a traditional 1911, of course, the trigger guard's round. So, as the gun's recoiling, eventually, especially the 45, which was pretty much the only thing on the docket, yeah, there was some Super 38s, and technically by this time, the lightweight 9mm Commander was out, but for the most part, people are shooting full ball 45s, and you under recoil, you're going to start to slip off that trigger guard, okay? What they were trying to do was find a way to counteract the recoil. Now, we, of course, we really don't want to make the mistake. Now, I see this happen too often, right? We look at something that is old or vintage and we think, that's stupid. Why'd they ever do that? Because we apply our modern lens to that situation. You can't do that. We're talking about an era of shooting where the two-handed, use on a handgun was relatively new, okay? Most people before then shot handguns one-handed, and of course slow fire was sort of the way you did things in the national match and bullseye era of stuff. So no one was really worried about recoil because, you know, bang, and then you come back on target and you're trying to be as accurate as possible. Now we're still trying to be accurate, but we're trying to be fast, we're on the move, that sort of thing with like combat shooting. So Gene Shuey, of course, he's like, you know, I'm slipping off the front of the trigger guard. We need to flatten that out, okay, and checker it so that it gives me something I can adhere to when I'm shooting under recoil. And I'm telling y'all, for a large part of the 1900 or the late 1900s, that's sort of how you shot, right? So you would obviously have your finger hooked around the trigger here. That square, you know, square and checkered guard would give you a good place to kind of rest and wrap your finger, kind of that finger forward hook grip, right? And so as you're shooting, you're kind of pulling down with this finger. You're pulling down to counteract the recoil. Really interesting, you know, because we're looking at how did those folks, you know, answer the problem of we want to shoot faster, but we still want to be accurate and bring the gun back down quicker. And this was one of the ways before kind of that more modern handgun grip kind of really took off. That was one of the ways that they were going to counteract recoil. So Armand Swenson really started this process. And the early stages of square and trigger guard were pretty stressful because, as you know or may not know, when you work on old guns, which at this time builders were pretty much regulated to Colts and to GI guns, neither of which are fantastic for, let's say, consistency. So you had to worry about the thickness of the trigger guard. So the way Armand Swenson would do a trigger guard, or excuse me, a square trigger guard, the most popular way is what's called a pulled guard. So you heat it up really hot and pull and kind of stretch the trigger guard out. Now the problem with that is, again, as I mentioned, you're working at a time where inconsistency is the only consistent thing on a Colt or a GI gun. So if the material really wasn't as thick in certain areas, you could break that off. And of course, at that point, you have to do the second type of squared trigger guard, which is a cut and re-weld. Now, you'll see cut and re-welds more often nowadays if you send a gun off to a builder who does do square guards that is on an existing gun, not on an Alchemy, of course. But on an existing gun, you'll find that that's typically the way that you're going to do it. Of course, that has its own challenges regarding the welding, of course, being, you know, the biggest thing there. You have to weld it, but you still want to have to keep parts cool so that when you finish the gun, you know, the weld doesn't have a different color than the rest of the trigger guard, that sort of thing. So the other way is you can machine it with the frame. Of course, that is what we do at Alchemy Custom Weaponry. Here is a prime with a square guard. Beautiful, 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 beautiful piece of equipment. I am loving this little marketing gun I have, and I'm kind of wanting to buy it, to be honest with you. You'll notice with the machine ones, though, they are a little bit more, we'll call geometric, right? They're very, very square, okay? And that opens that trigger guard up even more, but they're very consistent regardless, and they're very strong. And really, that's the best way to have a square trigger guard if you're just looking at it from the practicality standpoint. You know, you look at how the square guard and that sort of style of shooting impacted a lot of other custom smiths, right? So think about it. You saw the DeVales with like the hook kind of in the trigger guard. You know, that was kind of a byproduct of the square guard kind of hooking your finger on the front of the trigger guard era. Now, you see, the big thing that kind of happened was this was really the peak of cool custom gun. Like if you had a full house custom gun, it had a square trigger guard on it, more than likely. You see a lot of old guns. You know, we've got some of the past masters, you know, as Bill calls them, and of course, I subscribe to that theory too. You know, Swenson, Packmeyer, Bruce Gray, Jim Bolin, Paul Liebenberg, who of course worked for Packmeyer, then went out on his own, then went to Smith & Wesson. A lot of stuff with Paul Liebenberg, of course. Jim Hogue, King's Gun Works, one of the originators right there with the combat pistol, as well as Swenson. Swenson and King's, of course, were kind of the first two big combat fighting pistol companies, of course. Heine did a beautiful square guard. Of course, Heine is more of that transitional gunsmith where, you know, his guns looked like they could have came from a factory that way versus like a lot of guns like an Armand Swenson. You can tell right off the gate that, you know, this had a lot of old world style craftsmanship in it. And, you know, in one way that's a really cool thing, and the other way, if you're just being objective about it, it's kind of like, oh man, that's something else. And then, of course, you know, Alchemy is one of the few semi-custom manufacturers that still provides options for a square trigger guard. And then if you're sending a gun off to a smith today, listen, Jason Burton, he's kind of Mr., you know, Mr. Square trigger guard when it comes to him. He does a lot of them. He's very good at them, very methodical. The thing about Jason is, you know, he's a big, you know, Swensonite, right? And he's a big historian in the custom vintage 1911. So he really takes a lot of inspiration from kind of the past masters, and of course incorporates into his work. And of course, Jason Burton at Heirloom Precision, one of the shining stars in you know, one-man shops for the custom 1911. So he does a great job with the square trigger guard. And he and Ken Hackathorn are actually two people I have to credit a lot of information that I used for this video, because of course they know a lot more than I do, and I always want to check with really reputable resources before I try to give y'all information on anything. So from there, we kind of have to talk about when the square guard started coming out of vogue a little bit. And, you know, in my mind, it's still in, right? Like, I think that is still one of the coolest looks on a pistol ever, especially a custom 1911. This gun is a Dave Pegram gun. So this is, I believe, Triad Custom Guns, or Triad Customs of Greensboro, North Carolina. So this gun was actually built for Ken Hackathorn as his old duty gun. Now this gun was built in the early 90s. I'm talking about 92, 93, somewhere in that ballpark. And you see here, it still has a squared and checkered trigger guard. Now, I asked Ken, which seems to be the answer for almost every single person I've ever asked this question to. And I said, Ken, you know, by that point, were you still, you know, doing the hook on the trigger guard? And he goes, no, kid. You know, I just thought it looked really cool. And that is a reoccurring thing with the square trigger guard. You know, that's why it kind of went out of vogue, because a lot of people weren't going to pay to have that option done on their gun, because, you know, people didn't have a ton of money to be spending on these guns. I feel like the discretionary income from, you know, back in the day to now is much different. And people didn't have a lot of discretionary income to be able to spend money on the gun in the first place. So if they were going to, you know, obviously option it out, and they didn't shoot with their finger hooked on the trigger guard, they probably weren't going to option a squared and checkered trigger guard, just because that's not how they shot. And by the late 80s, early 90s, most people shot in what we'll call a more conventional, more modern style of handgun grip. Interestingly enough, dialing back the clock a little bit, I have here a Wilson LE Comp, okay? One of the coolest old custom guns in the business. Now, I have two LE Comps. I only have one out. The other one's at Milt Sparks getting a holster. But this is my earlier LE Comp. And the reason that I wanted to show you this, because it's not squared and checkered, is the fact it is checkered with a round guard. And those two LE Comps I have, because the second one is a 1989 LE Comp, 8990 LE Comp, and it has nothing, no square, no checkering, nothing on the front of the trigger guard. And I believe that's indicative of how throughout the 80s, you know, we went into the 80s shooting guns hooked over the trigger guard. By the end of the 80s, the modern handgun grip had taken over, and that's sort of when the squared and checkered trigger guard, you say that, you know, 3 times fast. Squared and checkered trigger guard kind of went out of vogue, right? And there was a time when no one did a squared and checkered trigger guard, or a squared guard in general. Not all of them were checkered, of course. The Alchemy ones aren't, because let's be honest, no one's really using that hooked finger grip. So there's no point in putting checkering on the front of that when you're just going to use it for obviously aesthetic purposes. Kind of fast forwarding there, there's been companies who have offered it in the past. Ken had a gun that was built by Wilson, but he had to source his own frame for the squared guard. I believe there's a couple other small companies that may have offered it or maybe even still offer it today, but I do know for a fact, Alchemy Custom Weaponry, we got squared trigger guards all day long, brother, and you ought to have one. It's one of those things where if somebody comes to me and they say, man, I really love old custom guns, but then the next thing they say is, I just don't really care for squared trigger guards, I think, I don't know if you really love old custom guns, because that is a absolute cornerstone of the custom gun, coming in through the late 1900s, in my opinion. Of course, Alchemy also did the Combat Limited, a Packmeyer kind of combat special tribute gun. Of course, this gun, gonna have a squared trigger guard. Getting all my words mixed up. Listen, being from the South, English is already hard enough, So, anyways, it's got a squared trigger guard. And let me tell you, the two-tone look, especially with a square guard, is one of those things that just really, you know how I said tingle and dingle earlier? Well, that's giving you a buzz down below. I mean, it's doing a lot more than tingling, you know what I'm saying? Even now, I'm looking at this thing getting a little worked up. And it's my gun, I see it every day. But, this two-tone square guard is just a freaking classic look. I cannot express to you how much I love it. Even the all blued guns here, I think really make for an attractive pistol. This one with a Vodecki, style, it's obviously not a real Vodecki, but a Vodecki style 3-hole trigger, it's one of those things where I kind of thought, I don't know if I really like 3-hole triggers, but really, man, if you want a clean, 80s style gun, that 3-hole trigger is where the sauce is at. This is just a really fantastic looking gun. Ambi safety, 3-hole trigger, squared trigger guard, ring hammer, the Bomar. This right here is an absolutely freaking awesome looking gun. I really like how this gun came out, and I'm gonna be honest with y'all. This is how this kind of went. I had a couple of guns that were out, marketing guns that were getting refinished, right? Because I've been using them for 2 years, and they get beat up, getting handled at shows and whatnot. This gun actually had a Delta hammer on it. So when it got refinished, you know the drill. I said, listen, can't have that Delta hammer on there no more. But let's put a ring on it. If you like it, you should have put a ring on it, right? So we put a ring on it, I hadn't seen it for a couple of months because, a few of the guns were out. Guns come back to me from getting refinished and all that, and I pulled this one out, and I immediately began to call Nick, my boss, and say, hey, what if I bought that gun for marketing and just kept using it for marketing? Because it's just one of those things where I see this and all I can think about is, this is what, if you were in the 80s, the 70s, and you wanted a custom 1911, ring hammer, commander hammer, whatever you want to call it, ring hammer, square guard, 3-hole trigger, especially in this one too with the adjustable rear sight. I mean, that is like you would have, you would have dragged yourself naked through thorns to get one of those, and it's a really special gun that really encapsulates, and I may have said that word wrong, but that's all right. I'm Southern. I can get away with that. The genre of the early kind of quasi-fighting, quasi-competition 1911, because let's be honest, in the kind of mid-century era, the 60s, 70s, 80s, competition guns and fighting guns really, blurred a lot of lines. I think the 90s is when they really started to separate, and maybe the late 80s too. I would have carried an LE comp back in the day. I'm telling you that right now. And I've read the Bill Wilson's book on, that's basically, I'm going to tell you right now, it was wrote in the early 90s. It's basically an advertisement for the LE comp. I'm not going to lie to you. It's what it feels like when you read it. But it's awesome for for obviously some context of that era. This gun was kind of designed as kind of the competition street gun, but then of course competition, guns got wilder and fighting guns didn't, but there was a time where you could have a squared trigger guard, Videki 3-hole trigger, ring hammer, adjustable rear sight, and hell, that could be your competition gun. It could be your street fighting gun. And I really think that's something special. And I am so proud. Let me tell you, it's more than just like, oh, I think it's cool. I'm proud to be a part of a company that still makes this homage to one of the great eras of 1911. So I love the fact that we do square guards. I think you should have a square guard. You should at least have one, okay? You should at least have one square guard. I've obviously got, let's take the marketing gun out. I've got 3 square guard guns personally with, I'm always on the lookout. If I see a gun that has a square guard for sale, I mean, that money's on fire as fast as I'm pulling it out of my wallet sometimes. So anyways, a square guard, it's just cool, right? It's just cool. A couple of benefits if you wanted some, if you needed some kind of marketing around it. You do have a longer flat here on the bottom of the trigger guard, and that seems to be more comfortable, I think, and sometimes allows me to really stretch out my, kind of offhand here onto the pistol, because you're not worried about it rolling up, onto the front of the trigger guard, because obviously it's kind of a hard angle there. So that's actually pretty nice, especially with our undercut. That really makes for a pretty pleasant shooting experience, I'm not going to lie to you. The other thing is, if you live in a world, I don't, and God bless me, I don't. If you live in a part of the world where you're unfortunate enough to have severe weather where it gets, where it gets cold, guess what? The square trigger guard, especially with the Alchemy way, really opens up that trigger guard even with a medium length trigger, so you can really get, a fairly thick glove in there to be able to still use your gun in cold weather. And of course, they're just freaking cool. Now, if you enjoy custom, old school, classic 1911s, Alchemy custom weaponry, we're basically your kind of people, I love old custom guns, as demonstrated by, of course, owning, and appreciating guns from Swensons to Pagrams to Novaks, all the way up to Alchemies. Of course, Alchemies are, that's my everyday gun. But in my opinion, a man ought to know where he came from, And the world that Alchemy custom weaponry exists in within the 1911 sphere started well before Alchemy was a company, And really, Armand Swenson is one of those people we have to credit for kind of beginning to the commercialization of the custom fighting 1911. Of course, there were plenty of other people at the time and before Swenson, but that's kind of the guy, who really put the custom fighting 1911 on the map. So with that, I do want to leave you with one other thing. If you're interested in old 1911s, this is, by the way, I don't get paid for this. Alchemy doesn't get paid for this. This is just purely one 1911 enthusiast to another. And if you're watching this, you probably are. You want to own, okay? You must own. It probably shouldn't even be, an option. It's required reading. We call the sacred texts. The Vicar's Guide, Volume 2. I took the dust jacket off, so that's probably why you don't recognize it immediately. But the Vicar's Guide, Volume 2, specifically, Volume 1's cool too, but specifically Volume 2, because it talks about all sorts of freaking awesome old school guns. Everything from, of course, this is the gun that's bookmarked, the Packmeyer Combat Special, because it's one of my dream guns. But you want to own this book. So I highly recommend you look for one, because you're going to want to look through it. And trust me, some of them pages, they're stuck together. There's a reason for that. I think you'll find it if you get the book. With that, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that this encourages you that square guards are really, really freaking cool, okay? I hear a lot of people, oh, I don't think that looks great. Well, you're wrong, okay? And this really isn't an opinion thing. You're just wrong. And so here I am trying to set the record straight. I got all y'all converted on the ring hammer because it's the proper hammer. Now let's get y'all on square guards because they're damn cool. So with that, thank y'all so much. Have a great rest of your day. Happy 45 Friday.